Kaplan GED Live lesson. In this lesson, we are going to explore finding info and graphics in social studies. I'm Nick Bascom, and I'm excited to walk you through this lesson. Let's talk about what we're going to deal with today. Well, at the end of this lesson, you're going to be able to identify relevant information in infographics. Just like we learned to, read for points in passages, by that same token, we're going to get really good at knowing what to focus on when we're looking at the different types of visuals, the different types of infographics. So we're going to know beforehand, before we ever get into the GED test, what we should be looking for, what we know is going to be relevant information for the questions that follow whatever infographic we're dealing with. All right, so we're also going to be able to, use the context of the infographic, or if it comes with a passage, with that passage as well, to make inferences, right? Inferences are deductions, just things that we can glean from the information that they have provided. Now, we're going to learn both how to make quantitative, right, like numerical inferences, as well as qualitative inferences about the information that we're going to see. All right, so we're going to learn some really important skills here. And keep in mind that, these infographics, we can see a lot of these different types of visuals. So this is a valuable lesson for us to learn as we're preparing for the GED test. All right, so let's talk about the different types of visuals and infographics first, so you get a big picture. And then we'll look at some examples of some of these different types to learn how to practice with them on our own. Okay, so when we're thinking about these different visuals, let's think about some of the categories, right? Like the different types of things we could see. Well, we could see timelines and charts and graphs, right? We could see political cartoons, all kinds of different things. There's a wide variety here. So we need to know what should we be looking for with the different types of visuals. Remember too that there are always clues in that question stem. So think about the clues in the question stem, right? And then you definitely want to make sure you do a lot of evaluation of the infographic as well. Okay, and remember too that sometimes the clue in the question stem might be a little bit redundant for what we see in the visual. So it's not a bad idea to take a look at that visual and start to understand, okay, if it's a chart, what are the axes? What are the units of measurement? If it's a different kind of a visual, like a political cartoon, think about the text and what we're seeing represented with the imagery. Okay, so it's a combination of those two things, but we definitely want to make sure that we really examine all of the relevant information in those visuals before we start to deal with the answer choices. Because if we're rushing, we might miss something. We might miss a unit, we might miss an axis, we might miss something important. So really make sure you consider that visual before you dive into the answer choices. Okay, so now let's talk about some of the specifics. Let's think about these photographs and political cartoons first. Okay, so with these visuals, we're not necessarily going to have units of measurement and some other kinds of things like that to worry about. But we still do want to focus on certain things. Specifically, we want to note, hey, what's the idea here? Or is there a theme that's being presented? We want to look for that. I love these political cartoons because they're like puzzles. Right? It's like a riddle, right, in visual form. We have to kind of puzzle out what the message is. So pay attention to the idea, the theme, even the content, right, can be really important. Obviously, we want to make sure that we don't just look at the images, but often with these political cartoons, there will be text as well. And we have to look at that text and understand how it, integrates with the image. And we have to understand how those interact, okay? Pay attention there. Of course, we always want to know what's the message. Is there an argument, right? What's the rhetoric here of this visual, of this political cartoon? So just like we do with every passage, we want to think about the author's purpose. Is the author's purpose here to argue for or against something? Which most likely in a political cartoon, that's going to be the case, rather than just being purely informative, okay? So think about that. Like, is this supporting or reacting against something? And if so, what is it? What's the message of the cartoon or the photograph? Okay, let's take a look here and let's practice doing some of this early evaluation. Let's take a look at all of the information that we are presented with here. There's a lot of really great stuff. Let's see if we can't do some of this predictive work before we ever look at the answer choices. Okay, so first we get this text over on the right. It's like really big. It kind of stands out, even more so than the image. And it says, okay, this cartoon was created during the labor movement. So right away we get some context. We're like, okay, where it's going to be in some way about this labor movement. We get a little bit of information about the source there, right? And it says early 20th century, so we know kind of the date already. Other than that, the source information below that isn't super helpful. All right, but now we have context, and now we can look at both the visual and the text right in the image. So if we look over here, we see clearly this person. If we look at the image first, we have like three big visual elements we have to consider, right? The person on the tree itself, and then the saw, right? So if we think about that visual, if we think about that, the attire that this person is wearing, right? This person's a laborer. This person's a worker, right? This is not, the robber baron who owns the the company or whatever, right? This is somebody who's a laborer, and this person, this guy's doing labor, right? Now, if we think about the other visual elements here, the way the text integrates with those two other elements is really, really awesome. Because on the tree limb, it says production. And with the saw here that he's using, it says strike on. So if we think then about how all of those things come together, in addition to one other piece of information, which is the title of this initial cartoon, which is down here at the bottom, it says Spiting himself. So we think about that, spiting himself. That doesn't have a very positive connotation. And so if we then look back at the image, we're like, okay, so if the laborer strikes, the laborer is going to cut production, right? It's going to cut production off. That makes sense. But what's the real message here? Well, look at where that laborer is sitting. What's going to happen when that worker cuts completely through production with the saw? If you think about that, the message will become clear to you whether or not the author here is for or against, right, sort of these laborers going on strike. Whether or not the author thinks it will be good or bad for the laborers in question. So if you can think about that and you can make a prediction, you'll be prepared to answer this question 1 here, which is going to ask you, of course, what's the viewpoint of the cartoonist? Go ahead and pause the recording and take the opportunity to read through those answer choices. See if you can't find one that matches all of that great evaluation and predictive work that we did here with this image. Once you've got it, start the recording back up and we will evaluate these answer choices together. Okay, let's see how we did. All right, so if we're looking here at the viewpoint, our prediction was, hey, this isn't going to be great for this laborer. Right, cutting through this saw he's gonna fall to the ground, right? So we're looking for something like that. So if we take a look here at the answer choices, hopefully we settled on B, that the strikes will have this detrimental impact on the workers. Fantastic, exactly what we were looking for. All right, now if we look at the other answer choices, let's see how they were off. A says strikes can achieve better working conditions. Well, that might be something that we would think the labor movement, the message would be of the labor movement of that time, but it's not the message here of this author, right? Because this labor is going to fall down, which means we can't just use outside context here. We have to really examine the visual that we've been given. So A is a distortion, right? If we look at C, C talks about farm workers engaging more than factory workers. I want you to recognize this as a classic type of wrong answer choice. This is what we call an irrelevant comparison. We never learned the difference in just this visual between farm and factory workers. So how could we know? How could this message be saying anything about those two groups? I mean, you'd be going a long way to say that the tree represents agriculture whereas this person looks more like a factory worker, right? That's a little bit too much of a stretch looking at those visuals that we've been given. Of course, D is probably the biggest trap here, right? Because it's true that, the most sort of the first initial reading of this is that, yes, strikes are cutting through production. But why have that worker there positioned on that point of the tree if not to say, hey, this is going to hurt the worker as well? Okay? So D is like half of, it's like half right. We have to go all the way. We have to go to B. Nice work. Like I said, I love political cartoons. They're probably my favorite visual or infographic to deal with because they're like little riddles, and we have to look at every aspect of them to really understand what the message is. Good start, though. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about political cartoons. Now I want us to think about some of the other visuals that we could be presented with, such as charts, graphs, and tables. And I always want you to be thinking about these things whenever you encounter these visuals. Like, you always want to think about all of the sort of extra stuff around the graph, right? The titles, the labels, the axes, the legend. All that information is going to be very helpful for you. And if you just look at the graph first, you're going to be kind of going backwards because you're going to look at it and you'll be like, well, I don't know what that line means or that line means. And then you're going to have to go to the legend and be like, okay, that's what it means. And then you're going to go back to the image and be like, all right, now I understand. So why not start with reading the title and the labels and the legend and having all that background down first before you then kind of go into the actual, chart or table itself. This is really, really important. And, the next bullet point here is crucial, is that with all of these types of visuals, you definitely want to be focused on if you see any trends or themes. Okay? So like if it's a line graph, is it like constantly going up, right, as you go left to right across the graph? Or is it constantly decreasing? Right? Like, is there no trend? Is it sort of a random scatter plot or whatever? You always want to be focused on that, though. Do you see something consistent, a pattern, or is it random? If you can do that, if you can spot that, you're going to be in great shape for reading for points, for making predictions before you ever see what's coming down the pike in terms of the questions. Okay, so of course, sometimes it can support or refute the issue by itself, depending on what's provided with the graphic. But we're going to see later on in the lesson today that there are some infographics that sort of come with a longer passage. Okay, and so you really want to combine the two and say, okay, does this image here provide support for this passage, or is this something that sort of counters the information or the message or the argument I'm getting in the passage here? Okay, so always paying attention to perspective and point of view. We know we're doing that throughout every aspect, right, of sort of any element of the GED test that has some of these like linguistic elements. We need to be doing that. Okay. All right, so let's take a look at this graphic and let's model this process. First, we would consider absolutely this title, right? Okay, what are we looking at? Well, we've got third-party presidential election support, and we see the time period, 1960 to 2012. Now, I would totally consider the axes next, right? What are the axes? What's the x-axis, the y-axis? And then once we get that down, we can see if we spot any trends. So if we look down at the bottom here, our x-axis, right, like as we move left to right here across this graphic, we see that is the time, right? Time is our x-axis. And we're going to start in 1960 and go to 2012. Now, we always want to be paying attention to our units. And it makes sense if we're dealing with presidential elections that we'd have data points every 4 years, right, when these elections occur. And so hopefully we note that that's how this graph is moving. Now, if we consider our y-axis, right, the y-axis is this one going up here, we see that this is the percentage of popular vote over time. So we can just kind of look at those data points and say, hey, in 1964, right, the percentage of third-party people getting votes was really low. But, up here in, 1992, the percentage of third-party presidential candidates that got a percentage of the popular vote, it was pretty high, right? It leapt up big time. Okay, so now that we've just kind of examined how this works in terms of evaluating the graph, What I want you to think about now is, just as we said before, do you see any trends or themes? Right? Like, has it been a consistent increase in presidential support over the course of this 50 years or so? Has there been a consistent decline in third-party presidential election support? Do you notice any clear trends with this data set? Maybe it's neither of those two things. Let's see. Once you've made your prediction, let's take a look then at the question. Well, as you might expect, the question is going to ask just what we said. Based on this graph, you may validly infer that support for third-party candidates did what during the 80s and 90s? Okay, well, now we're not looking at the entire graph. We need to zoom in. But we know, hey, if it's the 80s and 90s, we're dealing with all of this stuff here, okay? All those years there. So, maybe if we evaluated the entirety of the graph, we'd have to say, well, that might not necessarily be the same for this region here in terms of our time. Okay, so if we do that evaluation again, though, looking for trends, we could see that there's a lot going on here, right? Like during the 80s and 90s, first we have this sharp drop. Then there's like a slight bump, and then a big jump, followed by another pretty steep drop. So you see it's going up and down. And if we see it's going up and down, there's no way then that we could select answer choices A or B, right? It's not steadily increasing or steadily decreasing. It's not. And there's no way we could pick answer choice C either. It's definitely increasing and decreasing at different points, right? Which means that the only way that we could answer this question properly is to say that, hey, this is fluctuating. It's going up and down over that time period, which of course is answer choice D. Nice work. All right, so now we've seen a political cartoon and a chart here, a graph. Awesome. Let's do another graph. Instead of the type of graph we just saw there with the lines, right? Now we're going to have a pie graph. Looking at the Sanchez family budget. And again, before we look at the question and the answer choices, let's consider something about this graph. Let's take away something. Well, first, we know by the title that this is their family budget. If we look here at the legend, we can see what all this stuff, right, like what it corresponds to in the actual pie graph. So we see that, okay, food is going to be the vertical stripes and entertainment is going to be the horizontal stripes. Everything else is pretty clear cut in terms of the color coding. And we could kind of take a quick look there and say, well, we see what's, a big part of their budget and what's a small part of their budget. Right? We can kind of see how all these things fit together. All right, so once you've had a chance to take a look here, let's get to the question. The question reads as follows. According to the circle graph, the greatest portion of the Sanchez family's budget is spent on which two items? Okay, so we are looking for the greatest portion. So I want you to look back at the graph and see if you can't predict one of the elements and eliminate any answer choice that doesn't have that big expense. Did you find it? Hopefully you noticed here that the biggest expense is housing, 33%. Which means any answer choice that doesn't have housing right in it, like answer choices C and D, there's no way that we could select these. All right, so then if we look at A and B, the only difference between the two is whether or not food or entertainment is the next biggest part of their budget. And they have selected these two specifically, right? Like their traps are very predictable. The reason they chose these two is that those are the ones that are easiest to mix up based on the fact that they have lines, right? Well, if we look at that circle graph, the pie graph, the 20% is a lot bigger than the 10%. And so then all we have to realize is that, okay, well, with those vertical stripes then, that corresponds to food, right? Not entertainment. Entertainment is actually their smallest expense, okay? So we could confidently select answer choice A. But the big takeaway here is be careful. Don't rush through this, because if you do, you might find yourself selecting entertainment by sort of mixing up that legend a little bit, right, without giving it the proper time to evaluate. Nice job, though. It's another different graph that we now know how to grapple with, how to evaluate the elements that we're seeing. Nice work. Okay, now I'm going to give you some heads up here. this bar graph is maybe the trickiest graph that we'll see today in this lesson. So be wary of how this works. I'm actually going to give you some time to try to evaluate everything and see if you can't find the right answer on your own. Think through that graph. Evaluate what we said we need to evaluate first. And then be very cautious with how you evaluate the answer choices. There are some pretty nasty traps that have been laid for you here. When you're ready to talk about it, start the recording back up, and we'll see what you came up with. All right, let's see if you avoided the trap. And if you ended up falling for the trap, that's okay. We're always going to learn from the burn. All right, let's check it out. Well, the title here, absolutely where we should spend some time in the early going. And we learned that, hey, this is the divorce rates for just 5 countries in the Western Hemisphere. Just 5 of them. Okay, got it down. Well, if we look at our graph, we see that the countries are down here on the x-axis. And we see who the 5 countries are. And then if we look at the y-axis, plus this additional information down here, this per 1,000 people, right? We can say, okay, the y-axis tells us what the divorce rate is per 1,000 people in each of these countries. Got it. Okay, if you fell for answer choice B, you probably skipped this step. Because answer choice B is very tempting if you're rushing. Don't rush. Right? That's what leads to careless errors. Now, if we look at answer choice B, it says that Mexico has the lowest divorce rate in the hemisphere. Well, Mexico has the lowest divorce rate of these 5 countries, but we don't get a complete list of all of the countries in the Western Hemisphere, which means that B is a sneaky trap. Now, A is trying to sort of trap you in kind of the same way, but it's not even right, even if you sort of misinterpreted what this graph represented by sort of skipping over this the title here, which we know we shouldn't do. Cuba doesn't even have the highest divorce rate among these 5 countries. But if that had said the United States has the highest divorce rate in the hemisphere, it would have been wrong anyway. Okay? So it's like a poorly set trap, but it's a trap in the same way that answer choice B is. If you fell for A or B, that's okay. Now you know that, hey, it's not just something that that Nick is telling me because I need something to do. I'm telling you to do these things so that you can find the right answer quicker and that you can avoid the traps that they're going to lay for you. Okay? All right, now if we look at answer choice C, it says Mexico's divorce rate is decreasing. Well, this is just a static divorce rate. Right? We're not seeing Mexico changing over time. Time is neither one of our axes here. So there's no way that we could select answer choice C. It's the lowest of these 5 countries, but we don't get a sense of what that divorce rate is doing over time. Which means then that the only one that we could confidently select would be answer choice D. We clearly see here that Brazil, in fact, does have a slightly higher divorce rate than Mexico. That's indisputable. The graph gives us that information. We should totally select D. Okay? All right. So that's a challenging one. Congratulations for getting through it. And remember, every mistake you make, you're going to learn from it. Right? There's no better teacher than your last mistake. So we now have seen a classic way that they could trap us. That's as valuable as anything that we're going to show you today. Okay. Now, one of the things that we've alluded to, and that is something that the GED test loves to do, is to give us information from multiple sources, whether it be multiple passages, or in the case of what we're going to focus on today, if they give us like a visual or an infographic to go with a passage, right? This, the GED test loves to make us sort of consider and incorporate different perspectives or points of view and to see how they interact. Do they support each other? Do they, does one piece of information sort of counter the next? So we have to be prepared to deal with this information from multiple sources. And we're going to look at a passage that makes us sort of deal with text, long text, but then also to see how an accompanying infographic, relates to that text. So we're always looking to make connections, right? We're always looking to see, how, what's the shared topic here between these two? How do they agree or disagree, right? And obviously, we're always trying to focus on the relevant information in each. And don't forget that we can always get clues from the question step that will help us, know how we should prepare for that question. Okay. Remember that you don't have to memorize everything. You shouldn't. You should do targeted research. So use your whiteboards to keep track of everything. No need to memorize this. You shouldn't be trying to do that. And don't feel like, hey, I can't memorize all this stuff. If you're like, I can't keep this all in my head, that doesn't mean that, it doesn't mean that you can't do this. It doesn't mean that like this test is harder than what you can accomplish. Not at all, right? You should not be thinking that you have to memorize everything. Your whiteboard is there to leave yourself breadcrumbs, to help you find the information you need when you need it. Every time I work on any of these tests that I teach, I always do that kind of targeted research. I do, right? It's a necessary part of it. It's something we should get in the habit of doing. Okay, so again, when we're focusing specifically on connecting infographics with passages, there are some things that we should consider, right? Obviously, we want to know what's the shared element between the information and the topic or the main idea of the passage. How do they link up? As always, we're looking for the title and what the axes and the units do in the infographic, always, okay? We also want to make sure that, like we've talked about before, if we see any trends, that we note them, right? Because that could be a great prediction for what's to come. Okay, so now that we've talked broadly about what we're going to do, let's take a look at a passage and its accompanying infographic. All right, so now that we've had a chance to look at a lot of different types of visuals, different types of graphs and charts, and even a political cartoon, remember that the GED test loves to make us work with multiple sources and to see how those sources interact with each other and to think about multiple perspectives and points of view. So specifically, in the next part of the lesson, the lesson's all about the infographics. So with the next exercise, we're going to really look at how a passage and its accompanying infographic work together. Okay, so let's get a few things down, some things that we should be looking to do before we go through that process together. Of course, as we always do with multiple sources, right, whether it be multiple passages or a passage in an infographic, is we're always looking to make connections between the two, right? What's the shared idea or topic between them? What do they agree on? What do they disagree on? Right, we're always looking to understand those key ideas. And as always, we're looking for relevant information. Okay, so when it comes to dealing with that relevant information, remember, you don't have to memorize everything. You shouldn't be trying to do that. Don't feel like, when you get to a question on any part of the GED test, really, especially the reading and all the language we have to deal with, never feel like if you haven't memorized everything from the passage or the graphic that you're doing something wrong, right? Or that, you're not good enough to beat this test. Never think that. No way. Like every type of reading comp or any kind of reading passage I have to work with on any of the tests that I teach, I always do targeted research. I always leave myself breadcrumbs to go back and find the key information when I need it. It's just part of the process. So relax, make it easier on yourself, use those whiteboards to keep track of the sources and what the key message is from each of those sources. Okay, so as you are looking to connect information from passages and graphs, tables, and other visuals, you should be asking yourself some of these questions. Of course, as always, we want to know, how does it relate to the main idea of the passage? What is the shared topic or connection? Always want to be thinking about that. As we said before too, we're going to look at the title, the axes, the units, all a legend, whatever kind of extra information we get for that graphic, we're not going to just blow by that, right? We're going to focus on it. We're going to make sure we understand it before we dive into the questions and the answers. As always too, we're focused on trends, right? And we're thinking about trends, and we're also thinking about the relationship between the visual and the passage? Do the trends in that visual support or contrast with the message of the passage? All right, finally, this is something that, it's called extrapolation, right? And we have to think about looking into, looking beyond the data, right? Like, okay, if the data kept going, if the trend that we see in the data were to continue, what would happen? Where would it be at a certain point? Maybe we have to do a little bit of quantitative inference at that point to get it right, okay? But definitely want to think about going beyond just what we see. And you have to use the trends that you've been given to make that kind of prediction. Okay? All right, so now we've talked about how to approach this, in the big picture. I definitely want to give you a little bit of a reminder when it comes to mapping passages, right? Like, what should you be looking to do on your whiteboard? Well, remember, as you're going through a passage, you're always focused on, what's the topic here? And why did the author write this? Right? If you can get those two things, you are going to be in great shape for the questions that follow. Everything else, remember that you're just leaving breadcrumbs so that you can find details you need if it comes up in a question. So let's go ahead and read this first paragraph together. As we do, I want you thinking about the topic because they pretty much have to give the topic to us in that opening paragraph. So let's read. The sea otter, Hydra lutris, is a marine mammal native to the coasts of the northern and eastern North Pacific Ocean. So right there, we should be thinking, all right, it's probably going to be about, in some way, this sea otter. But it's probably not going to be just that. We have to get a little bit more specific with our topic here, right? Because, we would need probably a whole, 3 or 4 at least pages in an encyclopedia to really learn everything that there is to learn about the sea otter. Probably a whole lot more than that, too. So if we're thinking about the short passages that we tend to get on the GED test, we can't learn everything there is to know about the sea otter in that time. So let's see how we narrow our focus here. At one time, sea otters populated the entire coast of what is now the state of California and farther south along Mexico's Baja California coastline. Prior to 1741, the sea otter population worldwide is estimated to have been 150,000 to 300,000. Aha! So what happens in the next 2 sentences? We see this word populated and population crop up twice, which means that apparently this passage is not just going to be about the sea otter, but it's going to be more specifically about the sea otter population. And so at the beginning, we're just learning sort of what the population used to be back in olden times, right? Back in 18th century and before. Okay, so we could summarize that first paragraph as this is the background of the sea otter population. Now, let's look at what happens in this next paragraph. Let's get started with the first part together, and then on the next page, I'm going to have you do a lot of mapping on your own. All right, so the first big keyword that stands out at me here in that second paragraph, however. It's a strong contrast transition. So since they mentioned what their population used to be in 1741 in the previous paragraph, I'm thinking, okay, with this however, that the population has changed. Either the population has shot out of control, right, and something's wrong with that, or maybe the population has really been seriously curtailed, right? Let's see. Sea otters were hunted extensively for their fur between 1741 and 1911. And the world population fell to just 1 to 2,000. Okay, so it's not a population increase, it's a dramatic population decrease. And we learn why, right? So for paragraph 2, my note, I love to use those journalism keywords. Who, what, when, where, why, how. I totally would say, hey, in this start of this paragraph, we're learning why the sea otter population dropped. And I would totally leave that breadcrumb for myself. Something like this. Something like the note you see on screen. And remember, all of our notes could be a little bit different, right? That's okay. As long as it's clear and concise and helps you find relevant information when you need it, that's all that I care about. All right. So let's keep reading here this next chunk of text. I want you to see if you could summarize. If you think that there's a note that you would take to sort of address all the information here. So pause the recording, read through this paragraph, try to write a nice short summary, and we'll see what you come up with. All right, so let's start things back up. Let's see what we should have plucked out of this next paragraph here. Okay, well, we're learning more about how the sea otter population was affected, right, between in that time period in the 18th century and then in the early 20th century here in 1911. But we get more of their limitations, right, that their population dropped here. Hopefully we noticed this big keyword that came next, fortunately. And that keyword is so important because we know there's a shift coming, but also because it alludes to the author. It gives us a sense of how the author is feeling, right, about this decline in otter population. And anytime we can learn a little bit more about the author's motivation, the better off we're going to be for understanding the big picture and answering questions about the passage. So when the author here says, fortunately, we're like immediately we say to ourselves, okay, so the population went down, but what comes next, the author's a proponent of. The author thinks this is fortunate, that this is good. So if we read what comes next, an international ban on hunting, conservation efforts, and programs to reintroduce the sea otter, right, have contributed to the numbers rebounding. And it now occupies about 2/3 of its former range. All right, so it got, it wasn't just severely limited like it was in 1911. It's not back to complete, the complete range, but 2/3 is definitely a vast improvement, right? And we know too here that the author is glad that this has happened. The author thinks this is a good thing that different efforts have helped the otter population return, right, to not its normal levels, but at least closer than what it was at its lowest point. Now, hopefully you spotted this next keyword though, because this is crucial too. Despite functions just like a however. It's a detour. It's a turn, right? So, we've just learned that there are these good things that happen, but the despite signals to us that it's not all great, right? Something is still rotten. Despite these successes, the sea otter populations in California have declined, and the sea otter remains classified as an endangered species. Okay, so we had some successes, but things still aren't great. It's still endangered. The population's, declined again. Like, some good things have happened, but they're not out of it yet. Okay? All right, so maybe a note that you took was something like, hey, here's where we learn about the comeback, but this is when we get sort of let down again. Maybe even you put a note to say this is where we kind of get a sense of the author's feelings about this stuff. That would be very helpful too. Okay, so now that we've had a sense to think about that, the passage, and it's totally a great thing to do to sort of summarize at the end of reading a passage and say to yourself, okay, so that passage was about the, extreme decline, resurgence of the otter population, and then the fact that it's still a challenge. And if you do that, man, you're set up to answer questions. But now we get this accompanying infographic. And we want to take a look at this infographic to see, hey, what are the titles? What does the legend, like, what does all this stuff tell us that enables us to see how this connects with the passage we just read? Well, this is the current sea otter range in California. And we're like, okay, well, obviously we talked about population and range in that passage, so the connection here is pretty conspicuous, pretty obvious. Now this information over here, the current sea otter range, which of course is this, this part I'm going to highlight in green all the way down the coastline here, right? Like, this is important for us to note that that's what that represents, right? We don't want to skip over that. And if we look at maybe some different elements here, we can kind of see that there are, a variety of cities, south of San Francisco, but you see there's a couple, big cities like Monterrey and Big Sur and San Luis Obispo, and like all of these areas here that the otter population sort of spans that whole section, that whole region. The other thing I would draw your attention to is that what really sticks out to me too is this element here, where there's like the boundary of a refuge. And so, I'd probably be thinking about how that current sea otter range relates to the boundaries of the refuge. right? Because that's the other really big visual element here that we get. Okay. All right, so we've thought about how it interacts. And if we remember from the passage, remember that they used this very specific value. They said the current range is equal to 2/3 of the former range. So, we could probably say like maybe the former range did go up beyond San Francisco and down past Santa Barbara, even, well, maybe not probably all the way to LA, but, probably a pretty good stretch of the coastline. All right. So here we go. Here's our question. Anytime you see according to the passage, we know that we're dealing with a detail question. And this is precisely the type of question that we are going to use, our passage map and the passage to do our targeted research to get this one right. So this is a general question. We're just looking for, what detail from the passage is true, which means that the wrong answer choices are going to be false. Now, unfortunately, we don't get any clue in the question stem to tell us where to research initially, but that's okay. We can do our research based on what we see in the answer choices. Let's check out answer choice A. Answer choice A says sea otter conservation efforts have been more successful in areas outside of California than they have been within California. Well, we know this one is wrong because efforts outside of California are never discussed in the passage or the visual. This is a classic out-of-scope element. We can ditch A quickly and easily. Now, if we look at answer choice B, it says sea otter populations were threatened by water pollution as well as by extensive hunting. Well, we probably remember that there was hunting, and then there was a ban on hunting. But unfortunately, water pollution is never mentioned in the passage. So again, it's another out-of-scope element that we can say, hey, I can't research that. It's never mentioned, right? There's nothing about water pollution in the passage, so it can't be answer choice B. Now, if we look at answer choice C, this one probably is the first one that we would say, hey, we could research this. So answer choice C says sea otters have been able to live in habitats from which they were once eliminated. So we want to know is that were sea otters sort of kicked out of an area, and then they were able to come back into that area. All right, well, if we go to this part of the passage, we learn that programs to reintroduce the sea otter into previously populated areas have contributed to numbers rebounding, which means that, hey, they were kicked out of these habitats, but they were brought back into them, which is plenty of support, all the support we need for answer choice C. Now, answer choice D, I want you to see, is the biggest trap for this question because it's distorting an element from the passage. Answer choice D says the sea otter population is now 2/3 of its pre-1741 number. Now remember, it's not the population that's 2/3. It's the sea otter range that is 2/3 of its pre-1741 number. But if you had to do some research for that, you could go and find that in the passage as well. In fact, on this next slide, you see right here, it's 2/3 of its former range. Nice work on that question. Let's check out question 6. Question 6 reads as follows. Which of the following conclusions can be drawn from the information in the passage and the map? Okay, so this is the question we were preparing for that dealt with. Now, this is an inference question. We're seeing what conclusion can be drawn. We need to infer based on the of our sources. Again, we can't do research yet because we don't really get any clues in the question stem, which means we need to look at the answer choices and see if they give us a clue as to where we should do our research. So answer choice A says sea otters will soon have the same range they had prior to 1741. Well, I would actually look to the tone of the passage for answer choice A. Was the tone of the passage super optimistic about what the sea otters are facing in the future? Well, I don't know. It kind of ends on this pretty harsh note here, that they're still an endangered species. So answer choice A seems to be a little bit too extreme, so we should ditch it. Now, if we look at answer choice B, it says sea otter habitat has been restored only within the boundaries of the sea otter refuge. Well, wait a second. If we look at our visual, we see that that's not the case, right? That current range extends beyond those borders of the refuge, so it can't be B. Now, answer choice C says sea otters are still hunted in the area north of Point Año Nuevo. Well, if we look at what the passage says about hunting, and we do that research, it says, look, there was an international ban on hunting, and we never learned that it was like that ban was somehow removed, which means we can't select answer choice C. So all we're left with is answer choice D. Let's see if this aligns with what we get in both of our sources here. Well, answer choice D says the current range of the sea otter in California is larger than it was in 1911. Well, that makes sense, right? Because we had that like point where we did see some success, right? Where it was like really bad by 1911, and then we had a little bit of a resurgence, right? They were able to come back a little bit. Even though they're still endangered, they did have this positive momentum, which means that yes, since it's now 2/3 of its former range, that was a lot better than being limited just to Monterey Bay, which means that answer choice D is totally spot on. And both the passage and the graphic reveal that to us. Nice. All right, so now we had a chance to practice with a passage and its accompanying infographic. I want to finish up with a couple more visuals just to give us a little bit more of an opportunity to see the different kinds of visuals that we could encounter. And once we get through that, we'll just recap everything that we had a chance to discuss today. All right, so let's see the map here. Let's see the map here first. All right, this is the map that we are going to be dealing with. And over there to the right, you see a little bit about the question stem that we need to be concerned about as we're looking at this map. The question is, what region would have required the most significant increase in education spending over the time period? Okay, well, if we look at the graph, this is all about U.S. population, right? It's all about U.S. population. So, it's not about education spending. So we have to think to ourselves, well, okay, how do those two things connect? Well, I mean, you could have a population increase for people who aren't in school, right? I mean, it could be possible that most of the people moving to Florida maybe are elderly, right? They're retiring there. In which case, a population increase doesn't necessarily indicate an increase in education spending. But, that's a pretty specific scenario that I came up with, right? Like we could probably say that, hey, there's a likely potential that an increase in population means that maybe families are moving or families are bigger in these areas, right? So we could say, all right, if all I have is information about population increase or population change, then I have to use that as a way to say, hey, a population increase probably indicates a potential increase in education spending. Now, before we look at the graph, we need to understand the key, the legend, right? And so if we look down there at the key, we see that it's about percent increase in population. And we see this like tangerine like color. It's like a really light tannish orange, right? That's the biggest percent increase. Okay, and then if we look at the rest of them, we know the black is the next biggest percent increase. Pink is next. It's like a periwinkle, right? It's like a light purple lavender maybe, right? That this is a fairly small increase, and that the yellow is areas that really isn't, the areas aren't seeing a huge increase in population. Well, the question is, what would require the most significant increase in education spending? Which means we're probably looking at areas that see the highest increase in population. Well, if we think about areas that are experiencing, a large increase in population, there's really two pockets, right? The first pocket is over here, which has the biggest chunk, and then the other one is really Georgia, right, down here with this 20.1. But, I mean, if we're looking for a region, right, we would say that, well, even though we have some states that are in the second tier around Georgia, right, like we have some of those, we have another state here that's in that second tier. But, I mean, even the numbers for those three states over here, Nevada, right, and the states around it, we see, hey, 32.3, 24.7, 28.6. It's bigger than those states in the region. I don't want to give away what the regions are called because that's going to be a part of this question. Over there around Georgia and Florida and South Carolina and North Carolina. Okay, so now that we've had a chance to make that prediction, let's go ahead and deal with this question. All right, so taking a look here at the regions, think about which of those regions would see this or need this biggest increase in education spending. Once you think you've got it, make your selection, and we'll see what you came up with. All righty, so hopefully we realize that even though, the Southeast is kind of making a pull here for having a high population increase, that it's the Southwest that has those three big states with the highest percentage of growth, which means the Southwest is going to be the big winner here, right? The Great Plains, it's all pretty small, and the Great Lakes, it's all pretty small too. They're the lavender and the yellow. So, and the Northeast especially is like all yellow. So only the Southwest would have the opportunity to work here. Nice job. Another good use of a graph and another opportunity for us to make inferences. All right, nice work on that map. Now let's take a look at one last graph together. This is a great graph for us to finish on because there's a lot of great information going on. It would be an easy graph to sort of mix up, especially if we got overwhelmed at the beginning just looking at everything. But we know how to attack it, right? We know that, hey, a lot of what we see in the question stem is just going to be represented in the visuals. So let's go step by step. Let's start with the title. This is Unemployment and Inflation from 91 to 2000. Got it. Okay, so now if we think about the axes here, our x-axis is the time, right? It's from 1991 would be the far left of the graph, and 2000 would be the far right of the graph. Got it. Now, where this graph gets tricky is when it comes to how the axes, the y-axes, relate to the key. Okay, that's where this gets a little bit tricky. So first we have to realize that unemployment, right, is this like bluish purple line. We have to recognize that. And we also have to realize that whenever we look at that blue-purple line, we need to use this axis over here on the left. We need to use that because that's the one that corresponds to unemployment rate. So unemployment rate will start out at 7. And even though it ends down here, it's not ending at 1.5. It's ending at 4, right? So it starts at about 7 plus and ends right at 4. So that's the drop we're seeing. Okay, so then if we think about on the other side here, right, that other axis, the inflation rate, is going to line up with the sort of dotted brown, yellowish brown dots, right? So we have to pay attention to these elements here. So we end up starting around 4-ish, right? Notice I didn't say around 7.5 because we don't care about this stuff over here if we're looking at the at the inflation rate. Instead, it starts about 4 and it ends up about, I guess, a little bit greater than 2. So we see those numbers on the far right maybe are a little bit off of the actual lines, but we can say we kind of get a sense of where they appear. Okay? All right. So now that we've had a chance to evaluate the graph, we're going to be in a much better situation to answer the question about, which statement about the data is correct. So let's get some practice working with this crazy looking graph here. Well, answer choice A says between 91 and 2000, the inflation rate declined 1%. Well, we just talked about this, and we know that if we're dealing with inflation, we need these numbers here. Okay, if we're dealing with inflation, we're starting out here at about 4, we said. And we end up here, right, which is between 2 and 2.5. So at the very least, we're declining by at least 1.5%, maybe closer to 2, which means that there's no way then that we could select answer choice A. It's not accurate. Now remember, the other thing that we should always be anticipating whenever we look at a graph is, do we see any trends? And if you were thinking about trends, you would be really prepared to answer this question. You'd be really prepared to evaluate answer choice B. Now, I didn't want to give away the trend at the beginning because I wanted you to spot it and recognize that answer choice B is a really nice fit here. Notice that both of these lines have this downward trend, right? They are, over time, unemployment and inflation is declining in this period. It's not perfectly linear, but it is a relatively steady decline. That would help us say, hey, we really want to keep around B, right? The unemployment rate as the inflation rate both sort of steadily decline. There is a little bit of a rise up here, but for the most part, right, it's a pretty steady drop. Okay, let's look at answer choices C and D though, because it's going to give us some more opportunity to practice with this graph. So answer choice C says during the 1990s, the inflation rate declined more than the unemployment rate. Well, we have kind of already discussed how that inflation rate declined. We did that when we dealt with answer choice A. We said, hey, it kind of starts here at 4, and then it ends up around here, around 2. So it's like a drop of 1.5, we said, roughly. Now, if we think then about the unemployment rate, well, remember the unemployment rate starts out here at about 7 and ends up here about 4. So we see that drop is about 3, which means that the drop of the unemployment is bigger, right? The unemployment rate declines more than the inflation rate, which means C is the opposite of what we want. Okay, so then last answer choice D here says, by the end of the 90s, the unemployment rate was 1% more than the inflation rate. Well, let's take a look over here. We know we're going to have to think about both of these elements now. Well, if we look over here, we see that the unemployment rate, remember that's the blue line, so we know the unemployment rate was going to be about 4 at that final data point at the end of the 90s. Okay, then we said, hey, the inflation rate is going to be that about this like 2.5, right? So if we're looking at 4 to like a little bit greater than 2, we would say that it's not 1% more. It's a little bit more than that, right? It's at least about 1.5 again, which means we can't select answer choice D. So the only thing that we could select here, and it was actually something that we should be looking to predict always with graphs, it pertains to the trend in the data. And there's a general downward trend in unemployment and inflation rate in this decade. Nice work. That's a tough graph to evaluate, but hopefully we see now how to work with sort of multiple y-axes on a single graph. Awesome. All right, congratulations. You've made it through your Finding Info in Graphics lesson. We had a blast. Here's just a quick reminder of our big topics that we got through today. We definitely learned how to focus on relevant information, how to make predictions, and to do careful analysis based on what we know is always going to be important in these graphs. We also learned how to make a variety of qualitative and quantitative inferences about the information we're seeing. And we also learned how to link up information from passages with information in infographics. All right. You are now done with your Finding Info in Graphics lesson. If you need to Check out the recording again. If you want some more practice, you can always do so. Remember, too, that you're not done. We want you to do a lot of practice on your own to get these skills down. The best way to solidify these concepts to practice on your own. Remember, too, that we are always available to help answer your questions about anything you saw in this lesson or any other recorded or live lessons. You can always reach us at this email address that I've highlighted on screen. Okay, we can't wait to see you in some more Kaplan GED live and recorded lessons. Good luck. Happy studying. We'll see you soon.